Thank you very much. I'm going to begin this lecture by reading an excerpt from Heinrich Heine's Florentine Nights, which was written in 1837. In this novel, the narrator Maximilian recalled a soirée at the Chaussée d'Antin, where, quote, Franz Liszt had allowed himself to be forced to the piano, threw his hair up above his genial brow, and played one of his most brilliant battle pieces. There were in the entire hall faces growing pale, heaving bosoms, panting breaths during the pauses, and at last, roaring applause. Women always seem intoxicated when Liszt plays. With wild joy, these villies of the salon threw themselves into the dance, and I had trouble escaping from the crowd into a side room. 2 points in this particular anecdote merit attention. The first is the use of the term intoxicated, which suggests that the women's exhilarated response was something over which they had little conscious control. The second is the fact that those affected by his playing needed bodily release, breaking into a dance. Now, even if this account is semi-fictionalized, it recalls many other well-documented instances from Liszt's Glanzzeit, when his pianistic abilities sent audiences into frenzies of enthusiasm. Look, for example, at this well-known caricature of Liszt's reception in Berlin in the early 1840s. Here again, we see a largely female audience forming a mosh pit around the piano. True, at least one of the ladies appears to be drinking, but we're clearly not meant to ascribe their frenzies except to Liszt's playing. Note, by the way, the kisses flying in his direction. That's what those little bee-like things are. However, it wasn't only women who found his person and pianism compelling. A middle-aged diplomat who attended one of the fabled 1841 Berlin concerts wrote, "Our places were quite near the front, and we had a good view of this brilliant, clever, handsome man. His last piece was a grand galop chromatique, which I couldn't take. He had control of my pulse, and his playing accelerated it so much that I became giddy." Responses such as these suggest there was something genuinely uncanny about Liszt's playing. The temperament of the age being what it was, there were no shortage of romantic theories as to the source of Liszt's mercurial powers. Let us look first of all at one of the greatest critics of the age, Robert Schumann, who reported another experience of involuntary physical entrainment at a recital Liszt gave in Dresden in 1840. And now the demon's power began to wake. He first played with the public as if to try it, and then gave it something more profound, until every single member was enveloped in his art. And then the whole mass began to rise and fall precisely as he willed it. I have never found any artist, except Paganini, to possess in so high a degree as Liszt the power of subjugating, elevating, and leading the public. Now, not content with simply noting the hypnotic effect of Liszt's playing on the audience, Schumann ascribes this power to some kind of demonic agency. This idea that such skills and charisma had to have an infernal source is, in fact, one of the more common tropes in the reception of Liszt the pianist. When the publisher Ricordi heard Liszt improvising on the piano in his shop, he is reputed to have said, "That must be Liszt or the devil." Another Viennese critic found Liszt's playing so far beyond his comprehension that he wrote, "We have now heard him, this strange wonder, whom the superstition of past ages, possessed by the delusion that such things could never be done without the help of the evil one, would undoubtedly have condemned him without mercy to the stake. We have heard him and seen him too, which of course makes a part of the affair." Even Clara Schumann, no uncritical admirer, wrote on one occasion, "He played as always with a truly demonic bravura. He lorded it over the piano like a devil. I cannot express it differently." And these examples could be multiplied. Now, thus far, I've been speaking about perceptions of Liszt, the performer. However, it is well known that he was only active as a concertizing virtuoso until 1847. In that year, he quit his touring lifestyle and settled down in Weimar, a provincial German town with a rich literary heritage, but nothing much in the way of a musical culture. Even now, this decision seems quixotic. Why would Liszt, the greatest pianist of his day, perhaps of all time, turn his back on the extraordinary acclaim he met with as a performer? The answer is that he wished to become something more than just a performer. In fact, he particularly wanted to make his mark as a composer. And over the 13 years he spent at Weimar, he produced many of his greatest works. In the case of his piano compositions, some of these were revisions of pieces he had written, maybe even published earlier in his career. This is the case, for example, with the Transcendental Etudes. They were completed in 1851, but they began life as relatively simple studies in 1826 and went through an intermediate version of almost unplayable difficulty in 1839. So the Transcendentals that we know today are in fact simplified. Scary thought, that is. Other works, of course, were composed from scratch in these years. These include the Sonata in B minor, the Second Ballade, and the piece I'm focusing on today, the first Mephisto Waltz, which was written between approximately 1856 and 1861. There is some disagreement among scholars as to the exact dates. And now, we come to the central question that has motivated my research. Why did Liszt write this Mephisto Waltz so long after his virtuoso career ended? It's a work that exhibits in abundance the qualities that we associate with Liszt the performer. It's fast, it's loud, it's fiendishly difficult, and that pun is very much intended, and when played well, it can be truly exhilarating. In a word, it's the consummate showpiece. But Liszt had no need for this anymore, or had he? True, he often performed in private even after his retirement, but the Mephisto Waltz is so obviously designed to wow the public, as indeed it has in countless recitals in the last 150 years. So, what motivated Liszt to compose such a piece at this point in his life? Now, the simple riposte would be, well, why shouldn't he have written it then? It is by no means the only virtuosic piece he composed from scratch when he was at Weimar. Think of the Spanish Rhapsody or Nomenreigen. Liszt was still Liszt. He still possessed a dazzling technique, even if he only now played for friends and his pupils. However, I believe that this work is something more than just another Lisztian showstopper. The piece is based on an episode from Nikolaus Lenau's Faust, in which listeners are transported by the power of a skillful player. The Mephisto Waltz is therefore not simply a virtuoso piece that wows its hearers, it simultaneously describes the effect of such virtuosity on an audience. In a very recursive fashion, it is an example of the very phenomenon it is representing. I might even coin the term meta-virtuosity to describe it. Interpreted in this light, the piece can be seen as Liszt's reflections on his past career as a performer, but it also reveals something of the older artist's changed priorities. Now that probably all sounded rather abstract. I promise it will become clearer as we proceed. To start with, however, we need to know more about the piece and the circumstances in which it was composed. So in the next part of my talk, I'm going to analyze the waltz, both musically and programmatically, which will involve me interpreting how the music relates to the Faust story. As the word interpreting suggests, this isn't the only way to understand the piece. However, I will give reasons as to why I think my reading is at least plausible. Well, I think it's right, but hopefully you think it's plausible. Once this is in place, I will then move on to look at what the waltz might mean in terms of Liszt's career as a whole. Now, if one is not distracted by the riot of different typefaces, there is much information to be gained from the cover of the first edition of the Mephisto Waltz. Now, translated, the main text reads, "To Karl Tausig," this is the dedicatee, one of Liszt's pupils, "Mephisto Waltz, a dance at the village inn, episode from Lenau's Faust, composed for large orchestra and transcribed for the pianoforte by Franz Liszt." Recent research actually suggests that the piano version came first, but that's something that doesn't really affect what I'm saying today, so I'll just set that to one side. What is clear, however, is that Liszt wanted us to hear the music against the backdrop of the poetic work that inspired it. The version of Faust that he refers to is that by Nikolaus Lenau, not the more famous drama by Goethe, which Liszt incidentally drew on for his great Faust symphony. Lenau's poem was written between 1833 and 1836 and is a much less celebrated work. It is set out in sections entitled episodes. The one in which we're interested comes roughly a quarter of the way through the poem. Entitled simply Der Tanz, the dance, this 100-line excerpt falls into two distinct halves. The first part, which you can see in front of you, is laid out like a closet drama, complete with stage descriptions, scene descriptions, stage directions, and as you can see, Faust and Mephistopheles are the two people who are speaking in this half. The plot is simple. Faust and Mephistopheles, dressed as hunters, arrive by chance at a village inn, where a wedding celebration is taking place. Faust quickly becomes enamored of a comely black-eyed girl, but is too shy to go up and speak to her. Mephistopheles makes some sardonic comments on his companion's inability to turn desire into action and decides to lend a hand. He borrows a violin from one of the band of musicians, promising to set the party dancing to another tune. Now, at this point, exactly 50 lines into the episode, a break is indicated in the text. What previously was a dramatic scene now turns into a third-person narrative, which describes Mephisto's playing and what transpires. The music inflames the participants, Faust foremost among them, sending them all into a heady state of sexual arousal. Towards the end of the excerpt, Faust and his brunette dance out into the countryside, where the aphrodisiacal sounds of the violin fade away and are replaced by the equally sensuous nightingale call. With nature furthering the devil's devices, it is no surprise that they consummate their passion. Now, in crafting this scene, Lenau taps into what were by then well-established associations between the devil, violin playing, and dancing, though I haven't yet found one where all three elements are present. For instance, the devil and dancing were linked in two famous early 19th century works. The Walpurgisnacht scene from Goethe, the first part of Goethe's Faust, which features Mephistopheles dancing as part of the unholy celebrations on the Brocken, while, of course, the final movement of Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique in 1830 depicts a blasphemous witches' sabbath where they cavort in honor of Satan. The violin-playing devil, of course, was a compositional stimulus for Tartini in the early 18th century. His Devil Trill Sonata was famously inspired by a dream. But the iconographic record goes back much further. For instance, look at this woodcut from Hans Holbein's Dance of Death series, and that's in the early 16th century, in which a skeleton is playing a fiddle. Interestingly, in an early 19th century copy, or a copy of this particular woodcut, the skeletal violinist has become a proper horned devil. That's quite convenient for me. Closer to Lenau's day, the macabre appearance and transcendental abilities of Paganini led to all manner of infernal comparisons. While we know that Liszt was profoundly influenced by Paganini, I haven't found any evidence to suggest that Lenau had heard him play, although he must have been aware of his reputation. However, among Lenau's Viennese contemporaries, there is an even more likely source of inspiration, a violinist who was famous for stimulating people to dance, Johann Strauss Sr. To us, this might seem counterintuitive. Surely Strauss's waltzes are far too decorous to suggest anything infernal. In fact, as the illustration there will bring home to you, the waltz was far from being a demure dance in the early 19th century. It involved unusually close physical contact between the partners, and this intimacy was apparently only strengthened by the turning motion. I'm not a keen enough dancer to be able to confirm that. The following is an account of a Viennese ball in 1833, which begins with one of Johann Strauss Sr.'s quivering preludes. I'm just going to sort of summarize this. That's up there, just in case you want to read it all. In any case, in this quivering prelude, the writer says, one hears a whole while longer the long-held chest notes of the nightingale with which her song begins and ensnares the senses, until suddenly the warbling trill sputters out, the real dance begins with all its raging velocity, and the couple plunge into the whirlpool. No wonder that, and I'm quoting again, the couples waltz intoxicated through all the accidental or intentional obstructions, Wild delight is let loose. Now, if we look at the end of Lenau's episode, we find the same images. Inebriated couples, nightingale trills, which act on the pair, leading to their plunging into a liquid vortex. Intriguing similarities, to say the least. Moreover, the playing of Strauss Sr. seems to have had more than a touch of the Mephistophelian power, as the young Wagner experienced. I shall never forget the enthusiasm, bordering on derangement, generated in that extraordinary figure, Johann Strauss, whenever he played, no matter what the piece was. This demon of the Viennese musical spirit shook like a Pythia on her tripod whenever he began playing another waltz, and veritable whinnies of pleasure from the audience, indubitably attributable to more to his music than to the drinks they had enjoyed, whipped up the ecstasies of this magician of the violin to heights that nearly frightened me. So, how has Liszt responded musically to this episode? This is a matter of debate, as is so often the case with programmatic music. As an instance of music's notoriously slippery semiotic codes, consider the opening section, where the well-known quintal harmonies have been subjected to strikingly divergent readings. Robert Collis describes this as, quote, deliberate rustic naivete. The superimposed fifths represent the efforts of the village musicians. For Louis Kentner, by contrast, this passage, quote, does in fact express evil, if such a thing is possible. The marvelous opening, with its piling up of perfect fifths, one on top of the other, represents the devil tuning up his fiddle. Now, in spite of this divergence here, both Collis explicitly and Kentner implicitly interpret the major A major tune in bar 111 as the Devil's Waltz. So let's see this. For them, that's the Devil's Waltz. And this seems to be the scholarly consensus about this. Therefore, this piece becomes Mephisto's waltz in the most literal sense of the term. However, I am going to argue here for a deeper and more detailed connection between Lenau's poem and Liszt's waltz. Rather than consisting solely of a diabolical dance, I believe the Mephisto Waltz loosely follows the entire scene. In other words, I hear the music as representing the episode as a whole, not just the waltz portion. Can I prove that Liszt intended this degree of correspondence between poem and music? In a word, no. But such an approach would not be out of keeping with Liszt's views on program music. In one of his most important essays from around this years, he describes the painter-symphonist as, quote, setting himself the task of reproducing with equal clarity a picture clearly present in his mind, of developing a series of emotional states which are unequivocally and definitely latent in his consciousness. I will make the case that the series of emotional states found in the Mephisto Waltz do trace, broadly speaking, the course of the episode. Moreover, when Liszt published the waltz in its orchestral version, he paired it with another episode called Der nächtliche Zug, the night procession. In the case of this last work, Liszt definitely did write the music to follow the unfolding scene. He even inserted sections from the poem at various points on the score. Sadly, there are no such helpful cues in the piano score of the waltz, and in the orchestral waltz, only a single one. But this is above the alternative ending, which doesn't even exist in the piano version. We'll see this in a moment. So therefore, all we can say for certain is that Liszt could have written the waltz to depict the events of the scene. Now, in order to justify my interpretation, we need to explore the character and structure of the music. Let's look first at how the piece is laid out without worrying about the program for the moment. In terms of tempo, the waltz falls into 3 large sections: quick, slow, quick. In terms of musical material, sections 1 and 2 are thematically independent. There's no material common between them, whereas the third section there, the più mosso presto, is almost entirely built on transformations of themes heard earlier. The first 2 sections are laid out in a highly systematic fashion. After a lengthy introduction, which I've called I here, we launch into the first theme proper, the one that I played for you, the A major theme, which I've called V. For the moment, I'm just going to leave mysterious why I've called it V. It's just V for the moment. This is a brief, cheery, 3-phrase idea in A major, which recurs twice more in the course of this first section, as you can see. Statements of this theme are separated by 2 lengthy passages, changeable in mood and which modulate freely. And the second of this is, in fact, a transposition of the first upper fourth. So overall, we could say that this section represents, or looks like, a rondo, with the invariant A major theme as the refrain, and its occurrences are separated by the lengthy episodes. So therefore, if we had to put letters on this, as I encourage my students to do on occasion, I would say it's an A, B prime, A, a kind of very sort of square structure, very symmetrical. Nonetheless, this first section doesn't end cleanly. Rather, the music dissolves onto an unfinished harmony, a diminished seventh, as it transitions into the next section. This same rondo-like principle is found in section 2. Here, the main idea, W, is much longer and consists of 3 distinct but related ideas. Well, I'll play this in a little while. This is heard complete at the beginning and end of this section, and in an abbreviated form in the middle. So you've got W here, and then a shorter version of W in the middle. However, unlike the refrain of the first part, the texture here is significantly altered each time. The middle version, for example, is in 2/4 time. Separating these repetitions are 2 brief presto passages involving sinister, impish trills. I've called them M here. And as was the case in the first section, these 2 episodes are related by transposition. Again, we have a nice tight structure. We might call this a C, D, C prime, D, C. So in other words, a very square structure. Again, like the first section, it doesn't end decisively. It kind of drifts off and then links into the third section. So, in spite of the virtuosic technical demands, the many harmonic novelties that I've not talked about, and in section 2, the evolving textures, material has been used in a highly organized fashion up till this point in the work. All this changes in section 3. You don't need this. This is just me sort of proving that I've done the work. Themes from section 1 and 2 return, but in a much less structured fashion. In fact, structure gives way to process. Starting initially with V from section 1, but thereafter mainly focusing on themes from section 2, the music is subjected to a series of increasingly virtuosic transformations. After building to an orgiastic cadenza, the music then dissolves back into that impish little trill figure from section 2. A brief respite from the fury follows in the shape of a wistful transformation of W from section 2, before a final burst of excitement brings the piece to an end. The change is in section 3. They gave me a hermeneutic window into the work. The way in which the music abandons the well-defined structures that had been used earlier seemed to me to be a musical metaphor for the behavior of those listening to Mephisto's playing. Remember, all social decorum is forgotten as the country folk are swept into a frenzy. Sections 1 and 2, with their relatively square-cut structures, feel more like stylized dances. The character of the central portion, which is marked espressivo amoroso, can easily, I think, be related to the devil's playing, while then section 1 can be, somewhat crudely, retrofitted to the first half of the poem. The more detailed interpretation that I'm going to go through now was partly worked out backwards and has been arrived at by allowing structural analysis and hermeneutic reading to inform each other in a deliberately circular fashion. It will be noted that the narrative implications become ever more precise as the piece unfolds. Now, the opening 100 bars have given rise to very different exegeses, as we saw earlier. Remember the country versus the devil, but perhaps there's no need to choose between them. The figures in the right hand, which clearly sound the open strings of the violin, so all that along there, that could well represent the country musicians tuning up. And the overall harmonic context, which is indeed quite dissonant, maybe this is a suggestion of the diabolical. I don't really have very set views on that. But this whole introduction clearly leads into the A major theme. It's bouncy, it's jolly. To me, it very clearly suggests a rustic band rather than a devilish fiddler. So V stands for the villagers, now I can reveal. Again, it is narratively plausible that this theme should remain rooted on the tonic chord throughout. There isn't another chord, it's just all tonic. When composers were trying to represent the pastoral or things, they often went for a simpler harmonic vocabulary. It is also notably brief when compared to the two intervening episodes, which are far more active harmonically and tonally speaking. The figuration used in these episodes, let's just see an example of it there, resembles that in Liszt's nearly contemporary piece, Nomenreigen, the dance of the gnomes, pervasive grace notes, semiquaver runs above repeated left-hand chords, and changes of register, all therefore, by implication, Lisztian signifiers of the supernatural. Here, motives change with extreme rapidity every 4 bars, making this perhaps an evocation of the Faust-Mephisto dialogue, which dominates the first half. The final section of the statement of the villagers' music peters out at the end of stage 1, of what I take to be the moment of Mephisto's active intervention. He condemns their waltz as, quote, perhaps suitable for sickly desire on lame feet, and sets about giving the crowd, quote, a different music and a different sort of dancing. The central portion, marked espressivo amoroso, aligns particularly well with Lenau's description of the devil's performance. You can read that there while I just play for you the opening section of this section 2. That, for me, is devilish playing, rather than the opening A major theme. Now, unsurprisingly, the Devil's Waltz tune is a much more potent and complex entity than was the village band's dance. There are at least 3, possibly even 4 different sections to it. I'll just let you hear briefly. So we've heard part 1 there. Here's part 2. Carries on for another bit, and then we've got part 3. Lenau chooses in his poem to describe the music making as a series of erotic adventures. For instance, triple stopping effects are heard, quote, as though 2 youngsters were fighting over a girl. One, defeated, falls silent. The 2 lovers embrace each other blissfully. In double stops, the fused voices passionately ascend the ladder of desire. Another encounter sounds more voyeuristic, with a sinister hint of sexual violence. Now and again, a rising and falling and swelling, like sensual waves nuzzling the blooming naked girl's body. Suddenly, a cry sounds over the murmuring. The girl is affrighted. She calls for help. The fiery young lad springs up from the reeds, where presumably he'd been hiding. Now, whether these are simply metaphors for the reader or images that were actually evoked in the mind of the listeners who heard Mephisto, it's not clear. But it is clear that the devil's music is potent and protean. Now, Liszt's treatment of the first part of the waltz on its later appearances complements the evolving narrative. So in the final time we hear it, we have filigree passage work in the upper voices, raising the emotional temperature. And by the way, the three-part technique, which you can see quite clearly there, maybe that's a reference to these triple stopping effects. I don't know. You can make your minds up on that. Now, these three appearances of this waltz theme are interspersed by passages which texturally and harmonically suggest malevolent delight to me. Like many others before me, I identify them with Mephisto's laughter. Okay, and just there you have just an overview with now the programmatic descriptions put in place as well. In the final section of the work, we are given a sense of how Mephisto's playing has impacted on his auditors. The enticing tunes of the violin resound, and all are swallowed up in the bacchanalian round. Sometimes, by the way, all these translations are my own. Sometimes I bothered to try and turn them into rhyming stuff, and other times I didn't. That was one that I'm quite proud of. Thank you. So the villagers theme, which we haven't heard since the first section, returns. But it's in a different guise, and this is, of course, how Liszt conveys programmatic events. It was formerly robust and cheery, now it's pianissimo and played above a tremolo figure. In addition, it's no longer an A major, it's now shifted up a semitone to B-flat major. And B-flat minor is, in fact, the key that we associate with Mephisto's laughter from the middle section. So therefore, the villagers, by analogy, have been impacted by Mephisto, which of course they have. Now, thereafter, and again, I'm not going to go through this in any great detail, different portions of the central waltz theme are deployed in ever more virtuosic transfigurations. So there's just one particular example. You can just see the melody there. Da, da, dee, da, and down here we get na, 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 na. So again, the same melody, but just a lot more action in the right hand. Let's put it that way. So the most complex passage to resolve, and again, I don't think we need to go into this in any detail, is the passage at bar 651, which seems to me to be a kind of fusion of the village figuration, but the harmonic basis is very clearly derived from the waltz theme in the middle section. But again, that's for the written form of this paper, I think. When it seems as if the excitement cannot mount higher, because each of these transformations is becoming harder and harder to play, let me tell you, Liszt very cleverly relieves the pressure. It will be remembered that at the climax of the orgy, Faust and his partner dance out into the forest, moving beyond the sounds of Mephisto's violin, but not beyond his influence. There's a cadenza-like passage, which then in this music leads to a quieter section, initially using the devil's laughter theme. Then the piping of delight emerges from the scented bushes, and nightingale swells the ardor of the inebriated pair as though the singer were instructed by the devil. Few, by the way, have missed making the association between this particular section and the bird calls that occur in the poem. The denouement is appropriately graphic. It starts with a vigorous ascending passage, quietly, and then culminates in keyboard fireworks. Mephisto's baleful influence over proceedings is still to be observed in the eruption of B-flat minor at this particular point. The piece should be ending in A major. What's B-flat minor doing there? B-flat minor, the key of the devilish laughter. I am, by the way, not alone in hearing the link between this passage and the last lines of the poem. Their desire overcomes them, and they are engulfed by the thunderous waves of bliss. However, in the interest of full disclosure, I should say that it was over the alternative ending in the orchestral version that Liszt included this final line. And that alternative ending, have I time to play it? Okay, I'll let you hear that because it probably will be useful just for comparison purposes. A little bit of the harp cadenza. Not in the piano version. So effectively, I think it's easy, however, to relate both endings to the poem there. The first ending is kind of more priapic, sort of rising up, and the second one is a much more detumescing ending. They can both be, I think, easily related to sexual congress. And no doubt the first is the much more effective curtain for a virtuosic showpiece. And now it's time for an intermission from me talking, and time to see how convincing you find this interpretation in practice. I'm going to venture to hack my way through the piece, hack being the operative word. Like Liszt when he wrote Mephisto Waltz, I too stopped practicing and performing over a decade ago, but that's the only similarity between us. Can you remember the descriptions of Liszt's playing at the beginning of this paper? This won't be anything like that. Thank you very much. There's a reason I'm happily retired as a musicologist. Let me ask it once again. Why might Liszt have composed his Mephisto Waltz at this point in his career? Taking into account that it was written so long after his withdrawal from the concert circuit, might this piece, which traces the story of a great player bending his listeners to his will, be a nostalgic evocation of past triumphs? This seems plausible at first glance, but I think there's something more to it. Liszt's apparently sudden change of career from performer to composer took place around 1850, but it's indicative and symptomatic of a much larger social change which happened over the course of the 19th century as a whole, in which, to summarize it crudely, composers gradually came to be seen as more important than performers. This wasn't an isolated event, it was part of a whole series of interrelated happenings in musical life. The rise of the work concept, a new respect for the musical text, an increasing focus on older repertoire, and as a result, performers more regularly acting as interpreters rather than creators. These are values and attitudes which we take for granted even today. In the year when Liszt was still concertizing, however, things were very different. Kenneth Hamilton has rightly observed that at the heart of romantic pianism remains the idea that the performer, not the composer, is the center of interest. Performers often play their own music. When they didn't, they felt very free to change the music of other composers. Liszt was entirely typical in this, as he confessed in 1837. Previously, at public concerts and private salons, I often performed the works of Beethoven, Weber, and Hummel, and let me confess to my shame that in order to wring bravos from the public that is always slow, I had no qualms about changing the tempos of pieces. In my arrogance, I even went so far as to add a host of rapid runs and cadenzas, which, by securing ignorant applause from me, sent me off in the wrong direction. Now, I think even this is indicative of this guilt is indicative of what Holman Hunt might call the awakening conscience. There's now a consciousness that such practices were somehow wrong. As he got older, Liszt became more and more respectful of the text, so he would never let his pupils alter the music of Beethoven and Chopin, two composers he especially esteemed. Now, with hindsight, I'm probably going to have to run through a little bit of this, but early incidents in Liszt's life kind of can be seen to point the way where he was going. One critic had the temerity to say that Chopin was the better pianist, the better composer, the better musician. And when Liszt sort of was indignant about this, the critic wrote to Liszt and says, "I tell you, the day when the inward Liszt comes out, the day when that amazing power of execution has its counterpart and its complement in composition, on that day you will be called the first man in Europe." So, in other words, this person didn't see Liszt's compositions as matching up to his performances. And in 1840, that was definitely true. Another nudge, yes, okay, I'll skip over that particular bit. But in any case, when he settled in Weimar, Liszt was attempting to create a legacy that would survive him. George Eliot visited him there, and she talked about the fact that we are allowed to be extravagant in our admiration for music, for artists who like our performers, because they're going to be dead, and the only thing that will survive is the memories of their superannuated contemporaries. However, Liszt may turn out to be something more than this, because he is now devoting himself principally to composition and may perhaps produce something perennial. So, skipping ahead another little bit there. So, Liszt as a composer could hope for a more lasting monument than he could as a performer. His new career demanded intellectual discipline and patience more than before, and of course this didn't change overnight. The following anecdote I think is rather indicative. Just after his retirement in 1849, he was once cajoled into playing the reminiscences of Don Juan, of Mozart's Don Giovanni, before a small audience. His friend Fanny Newald recalled that the music became ever wilder, more bacchanal, ever more demonic. The men, glasses in hand, finally all sprang up from the table and surrounded the player. And in the end, Liszt, as excited as everyone else, rose from the piano and half laughing, half angry, burst out, "You shouldn't make me play these sorts of pieces. I ought not to be carried away." But anyway, it's done. Now this remark, if accurately reported, shows how ambivalent Liszt had become about what Caroline Abate might call the drastic experience of performance. The alternative category, by the way, for those who aren't familiar with her essay, is the Gnostic, a more cerebral and contemplative dimension. He aspired now to be more than what Lawrence Kramer has described as, quote, the charismatic performer who takes control of the audience's emotions and debases them by associating it with the visual, the uncanny, and the bodily. But then, what about the Mephisto Waltz? Isn't the final section basically all about this kind of excitement? It's just a series of random variations on a tune, exactly what he might have improvised in his earlier days. However, as I hope you see now, this looseness of structure has now become a positive value in the finished work. It has a point beyond itself. It's expressing the story. And so to my final paragraph. By dedicating this work to perhaps his greatest pupil, Karl Tausig, Liszt was clearly handing on the baton to the next generation of pianists. Ultimately, therefore, I see this work not as a sentimental revisiting of his past triumphs, but rather as a practical way of ensuring their permanence after a fashion. In an era before recorded sound, the score was all that survived the artist. It might be a poor record. Charles Halle tells us that he who has not heard Liszt can have no conception, literally no conception of what his playing is. But if the Lisztian aura is gone forever, a kind of Gnostic imprint of the man survives in pieces like the Mephisto Waltz. Walter Benjamin wrestled with similar ideas in his famous essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, where he noted that, quote, in permitting the reproduced object to meet the beholder or listener in his own particular situation, it reactivates the object reproduced. By analogy, Liszt is reincarnated through performances of his music. Or perhaps it should be reversed. Pianists who play the Mephisto Waltz become Liszt's surrogates, doing the bidding of their Mephistophelian master. Whenever we find our feet tapping or our pulses racing at a bravura performance of the waltz, Liszt is exerting his spell anew. Just as the effects of Mephisto's violin playing were still felt when the performer could no longer be heard, so too Liszt's virtuosity continues to exert its uncanny influence from beyond the grave. Thank you very much.